Hi, my name is Louise Manning and I'm Professor here at the Royal Agricultural University. And this short video is one in a series of videos that can be found on YouTube where we're discussing data and how we use data in smart food chains. This particular video is entitled Using Data to Drive Decision Making. So what are we going to cover in this session? We're going to think about what data is and what is the right data to help us make better decisions. We're going to think about how we use data. Do we use data to tell our story, or do we look at the data and then think about the story that that data tells? And how do we use data to drive our decision making? So what is data? Data is essentially the facts or numbers that we collect and then examine or analyse. And it's through this data analysis that we then use that original data either on its own or with data from other sources to help us to inform our decision making. There are many different types of data that can inform our decision making, and it's important to think about the nature of that data when we use it in our thought processes. So I just wanted to start here by talking about just three different examples. The first example is raw data. So it's data in its original form that has not been processed or analysed in any way. We can think of aggregated data. Data sets where we have taken data from a range of different sources and we've drawn it together. And it's in that drawing together and analysing process that we then give that data meaning. An example would be benchmarking of different farm systems, looking at financial performance, environmental performance. We may draw together data from a whole range of different sources, and we then add value to that data in the way that we combine it together in terms of how it informs decision making. Or we may be using metadata, and that's data that provides information on other data that we can be using. And it's really important, for example, that we think about how we present data when we combine it together. If I'm talking to a group of farmers in the UK, do I talk about acres or hectares? When I am looking at a whole range of data and then applying it, how do I use the language of the other people in the conversation if I wish to inform not only mine, but their decision making? So the types of data and the context we give to data is very important. We can also think of data in terms of how organised it is. So we could be working with structured data where we are taking information, potentially on a range of characteristics, and putting it together in a database or spreadsheets. And then we may be searching or manipulating that data. We could have semi-structured data. So it's following a structured format, but it's not organised. So if I was looking at media information around my brand, I may be using posts or tweets in social media. For some of the key terms or phrases, I may be looking for, there is an element of organisation where it might appear in a sentence, how different words can be drawn together. And I could be looking not only for individual pieces of text and search terms, but also how that data is organised in a semi-formal way together. Or I could be looking completely for unstructured data. It could be data that is contained in text. It could be data that is contained in numbers, videos, but it's all pulled together And from drawing all that unstructured data, often from a variety of sources, in drawing that together, I will then give it individual meaning, and it is that meaning that informs my decision making. So one of the first questions we had is, what is the right data? And UNESCO give these 5 principles of being right in terms of the data that we might use to inform our decision making. Is the data relevant? Do we get the right data? Not only is that data relevant, but is it precise enough for us in order for us to make a decision? What's the timeliness associated with that data? Do we get the data right away? Is that data, as we've talked about in previous webinars and videos, is that data giving us information about now, what's happened in the past, or potentially what could happen in the future? What's the process in which we gather that data? Are we getting the data in the right way? Because that can affect the data quality and the consistency of gathering data over a range of time. And do we get the right data management? Once we've drawn the data together, how do we make sure that it is reliable, it reflects the practices or the situations that we are considering? And how do we make sure that we have good quality control in practice? All of these principles are really important if we are going to have sound decision making based on data. So following on from the previous slide, do we want to know where we're going? So we're looking for lead indicators in terms of data. Or do we want to know where we've been? So we're using lag indicators that will tell us about what's happened in the past. I could talk at length about the characteristics of data, and we've touched on it already when we thought about what is the right data that will inform decision making. But here I'm just going to cover the work of one particular group of academics, and Marvin and Al, when they were looking at big data with regard to food safety. But I think this set of characteristics of data are far more wide-reaching in the food supply chain in terms of characteristics than just thinking of food safety alone. How representative or valid is my data? What's the value that that data gives me? Not only in terms of its intrinsic value, it will tell me my profitability, but also that it can identify a whole range of ways in which I can add value within my business. In other words, is it valuable to me? What's the variety of data that I'm collecting? Because am I going to have to draw it together and modify it in some way before I can use it in a data set? What's the velocity of my data? How fast is that information generated? Obviously, there's an element that reflects back to timeliness, but also how fast can it be processed? The veracity of the data. How truthful, honest is my data, and how clearly and accurately does it give me information about my supply chain? What's the degree of uncertainty associated with the data? What are the assumptions I've made when I've analysed that data? Is the data visualisable, not only by me, but people that work for me or people that I'm communicating with where I'm trying to effect change? If the number or the data or the text cannot be translated into information that is visualizable by others, it will limit the impact of our conversations and our communication. And what's the volume of the data that's being produced that I need to process in order to be able to make a decision. Because if I have high levels of data that I have to process in terms of volume, then that can affect the cost of the data analysis process. So these are just a few of the characteristics of data, but for me are real key aspects that you have to think about in terms of the quality of your decision making when it is informed by data. I've drawn together some of the key steps of database decision making, and I'm now going to talk about each one in turn. It's important that we think about each of these steps when we are developing a data collection and analysis process. If any of these elements are weak, it will ultimately impact on the quality of our decision making. Issue definition. What is my problem? If I cannot clearly articulate, define, describe, write down my problem, what I am trying to solve, then this will ultimately weaken the whole process that I'm about to outline. What methodology am I going to use? How am I going to collect my data? This lies at the heart of the characteristics of data that I've spoken about. How representative is the data set? What does it represent? This particular shift in a food factory, how production operates every day of the week, this one factory compared to a whole range of other factories. When I make a decision, how representative is this data? Have I used convenience sampling? So I've just gone out and collected the data that is the least expensive to collect, that I can collect in a timely fashion. In doing that, how does that then affect the quality of the data and how it informs decision making? Is there the potential for bias in my data? How, in the way I've collected it, will it impact on how I can then use that data to change the processes and protocols within my business? I've just listed 3 different aspects here, but there are many more. But essentially, we have to think about how, in the way I've designed my data collection, will that then ultimately influence the quality of data that I have at the end of the data collection process. What is the data I'm collecting? Is it uniform? Coming from a variety of sources, different kinds of data that I'm collecting together. When I'm collecting it, what period of time am I collecting it over? And is my data collection method during that time changing? All of these things are aspects we need to think about before we undertake the data analysis element and before we make any decisions. In summary, how has the data collection process influenced the data I have? When we're undertaking data analysis, that's when we can introduce a whole set of biases that will inform our decision making. If I have outliers, strange results in my data, do I just disregard them? Or do I look at those outliers in more detail? What inference am I going to draw from my data? Am I going to look at it descriptively, or am I going to seek to identify relationships between different elements of my data? How am I going to characterize some of the groups of data that I might have? And when I start to group my data to analyze it, what impact will that have on the results? All of these things are key aspects we have to think about if we're collecting data to inform decision making. For me, in terms of data informing decision making, how we communicate the results is a really key part of this process. Who am I communicating these results to? In what format are they more likely to engage with the results of my data gathering, my data collection, and my data analysis? Do I have to think very clearly how I am going to present the information to my audience? Have I got to aggregate some of that data into key indexes or measures to shortcut some of the engagement with my results? In doing that, will I ultimately impact on people's decisions to make up their own mind about the results that I have? In communicating the results, does that provide myself or others enough information to take action? How am I going to use the data to effect action? Am I going to use the data to be a call of arms to dramatically change what we do as individuals, a team, or as the business itself? Or am I looking for the data to inform a series of decisions that will allow a transition over time? It's really important that in these last 3 stages, communicating results, making a decision, and taking action, that we think about our approach as managers and leaders of teams, because it is the approach through these elements that will determine the level of success. This last element is one of the most crucial. How are we going to reflect on our decision making? Are we going to use data to inform that reflection? And then how does that feed back into our redefinition of the original problem? Reflection is critical in any decision-making process. And all too often, as managers and leaders, we do not give it sufficient time and resource. So these were the 3 questions that we set ourselves at the beginning of this session. Hopefully now you'll be happy to think about more clearly what the right data is for you in addressing the particular issue at hand. Once we have designed our data collection process and we've analysed our data, do we analyse it in a way that tells the story we want to tell, or do we use the data to tell its own story? What inbuilt biases or restrictions do we place on our data collection approaches? And how do we use that data to drive our decisions, but also how we communicate decisions and responses to data, take action, and then reflect, and then redesign our problem, question, or issue that we seek to solve. So this short video has been developed to facilitate us thinking about data and how we use data to drive decision making. Hopefully you've found it of interest and you have some takeaway messages from listening and watching the video, and I hope that you dip into another video soon. Thank you for listening.